Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about why spiritual isolation can slow your development. So there are many spiritual traditions that use spiritual isolation as a component of their spiritual path. And this is not entirely a bad thing at all. What this may include is people may go on retreats, like a short-term retreat. People may do practices in secret and remove themselves from the general vicinity of others. People may end up going into an ashram or a spiritual center and never really going out to see the world, just being in a spiritual community. People may permanently create their own spiritual community, has limited interaction with the wider world. And this is very much about a spiritual isolation. Now, the idea behind the spiritual isolation is not necessarily a bad idea. It's the idea of purification, right? So wanting to keep out the sort of negative influences and then to purify oneself internally. So in essence, this is not a super bad thing. And at some point, it may be very helpful. But the challenge becomes when people become very isolated and there isn't a integration process that's happening inside of them. What basically happens is if you've never meditated before and you start to go inside, you start to become aware of things that you were not aware of before, right? And some of this stuff becomes partially, it rises to your consciousness. But there are other parts of you that do not, because it is very much in the darkness of what some have called your unconscious. It won't come out until it is triggered to come out. So part of the drive for this whole purification process is to clear up what's inside, the sort of dysfunctional elements inside of oneself, which is creating some sort of problem, some kind of havoc internally, and is usually triggered by things in the outside world. And the challenge is the sort of dysfunctional or fragmented nature of what's happening inside will not be solved, cannot be purified by being isolated. Now, it is true that if you focus internally and are not distracted from the external world, you get the opportunity to go within, and that is a good thing. But where it becomes a problem is that if you are isolating yourself, expecting that your spiritual isolation and the purification is the sole thing that is going to help you spiritually develop, you are in for a bit of a ride, because it won't happen. And there are many people who have gone into isolation for decades or more and have gone back into civilization and been re-triggered again and again. Now, this means that while they were isolating themselves, whatever work they were doing in that isolated environment, they were having some success, but they were not able to process all the unconscious stuff. And then when they get back into the world, they get triggered again. And then the idea is that the world is to blame for their reactions, when in actual fact, it's really about what needs to happen internally. And having a little bit of stimulation on the outside can be very helpful, because it points you towards things that you need to work on, basically. So at Modern Kriya, we take an approach where we recognize that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're not aware of, and what one might call the unconscious. And then running away to an ashram or isolating oneself in a particular lifestyle where you have very limited contact with other people is not necessarily going to be in your best interest. So the idea is, and it's interesting because Kriya Yoga kind of brought this into a balance, at least under the householder lineage of Lahiri Mahashai, where Lahiri basically advised his students to have their regular lives, to continue all their regular activities, to continue even their religions. And the idea was that by doing the internal process and then being exposed to the external world and interacting with the external world, it would bring things into a balance. So whatever needed to come up because you were stimulated from an experience from the outside, then you would have an opportunity to awaken and become aware of that aspect of yourself internally in meditation and have some resolution. But at Modern Kriya, we take this much, much farther, because we're informed by a Taoist internal alchemy approach. And a large part of this is very much about getting in touch with the shadow side, meaning the unconscious part of ourselves that is Modern Kriya. We're informed by a Taoist internal alchemy approach. And a large part of that is about getting in touch with that unconscious side of ourselves. so that we can start to allow resolutions to happen. Because as we know, sometimes we'll act in a way that we hadn't anticipated because people say it's like an instinct. Really what it is the unconscious that directs our activity in that reaction. It is unconscious until it gets expressed, right? Try and isolate ourselves and say no stimulation at all, hoping that the dust will settle and then we'll become calm and clear and be like that till the end of time. Basically means that we want to get into a state of stasis so we can feel some peace. But that's not a long-term solution at all. So at Modern Kriya, we take the perspective that spiritual isolation will only serve you for the short term. And inevitably what's going to happen is those issues are going to start to repeat themselves. So as if you had the experience as a child, if you go away to camp, you get away from your family and you're not triggered by your family stuff, and then you start to interact and everything with people at camp and you feel like, oh wow, a big weight is off my shoulders. But if you're there for long enough, inevitably what happens is the behavior that you have that's already inside of you will start to reproduce itself over and over again with a new set of people. Well, the reason is because those patterns that are inside have not been changed. You've just shifted the environment, right? So it's not a long-term solution for you for spiritual evolution. What we need to do is to get inside and allow an integration process to happen. So at Modern Kriya, we're informed by a Taoist internal alchemy approach, and it's very much about an internal harmonization. And so at Modern Kriya, when we start to work internally, we start to work to establish an internal harmony. We're not trying to run away from the world. We're not trying to isolate ourselves. What we're trying to do is to integrate the disparate aspects of ourselves, the little fragmented parts within us which form our unconscious, right? We will start acting in a certain way because we have these unresolved issues. So consequently, that's what we try and do, is we take this approach where we are doing an internal resolution. We're creating an internal harmony. So many of the things that we start to do with that include things like the inner smile, the 6 healing sound, the fusion of the 5 elements, and other practices where we start to get internal and we start to integrate those disparate parts of ourselves. Now, if we ran away and we isolated ourselves spiritually, that integration wouldn't happen unless we actually did something with it, right? And that's the whole point, is that if people run away to an ashram and try to purify themselves, they're not necessarily going through a process of integration. What they're doing is going through a process where they're trying to repress things that they find are not functional for them, right? So it might be that they have what they call character flaws, right? These are really unresolved character traits, but when they talk about them as flaws, they want to be eliminated. They want to be burned up in some kind of spiritual fire. And we know that doesn't work because they will surface again and act themselves out in our personality. And so as a result, for that, this sort of purification method does not work at all. And so monastic communities, it's often a case, right, where people are struggling with the issues that they have, the unresolved issues, and being in this isolated environment can often people can be driven to, some extremes, right? So, and a lot of people, end up leaving those ashram, those spiritual communities, because they feel stagnant, right? So the stuff that they came there for, they thought that the guru, they thought God or whoever could resolve that for them by them putting them at the feet of the spiritual leader, that somehow the spiritual leader could empower them and take away that pain. But really what needs to happen is an integration needs to happen, this process of internalization and integration. So it's not about running away, right? It's not about isolating oneself. It's about having a normal interactive relationship in your life, but then having the tools to allow that integration to happen. That's why spiritual isolation is not an effective strategy for resolving things internally, and will slow down your development, because basically you're removing all stimulus from the outside, expecting you can resolve things internally, and then you don't have the tools to do that, and consequently you're going to suffer and you're going to sit there, and ultimately you're going to leave, whatever, if it's a monastic community or whatever, if it's a retreat, you're on a 10-day retreat and you're like, oh my God, like I'm going crazy, right? Because all my stuff is coming up but I can't deal with it, right? All that stuff, it doesn't help. So you want to use an internalization process that integrates those fragments, those fragmented parts of your personality, of your energy, so that you can get a synthesis. You can bring those parts together, you can get an integration, and you can get some spiritual development. And then interacting with your regular world on the day-to-day, there isn't a major issue. And sure, you may still be triggered, but you're going through a process of development and refinement internally. That's what Taoist internal alchemy is really about. We have the full gamut of Kriya Yoga and Taoist internal alchemy available for our members, so you can sign up up for a membership on our site, moderncrea.com. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to send me an email at info@moderncrea.com. Also check our website at moderncrea.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.